Welcome to Swami Reacts. Today we will be sharing a few thoughts on this beautiful book from Mircea Eliade, The Sacred and the Profane. This for me has been a preparation. I was not thinking about reading this book. Actually, I have ordered some time ago this series of books by Mircea Eliade, monumental series, A History of Religious Ideas, which I've received a recommendation for some time ago. You can see it's a thick project waiting for me. But recently, visiting a friend of mine, I found in his bookstore, his library, Sacred and the Profane. And he suggested this could be an introduction by Mircea Eliade to warm up for this other big work. So I went for it. Do not regret. Beautiful book. So who is Mircea Eliade? He was a Romanian historian of religion. He was a philosopher. He was a novelist, interestingly, and he became one of the most influential voices in the study of comparative religion. So his work explores how human beings across cultures, across times, epochs, have structured their lives around the principle of, or the perception of the sacred. As this book, of course, already hints at that. The sacred and the profane. This is a topic that I personally love so much because you ultimately, as I have written in the last chapter of Radical Personalism, sharing the initial quote of that chapter was, there are only sacred things and desecrated things. Ultimately, there is no profane things. There are only things that we desecrate by our lack of vision. But in principle, everything is sacred. So the sacred and the profane is one of his basically seminal texts. And it's a deep meditation, if you will, a deep contemplation of how traditional societies perceive space, time, nature, the human body, through the lens of the sacred. Though it's called the sacred, the profane, you will see if you go to this work, the main emphasis is sacredness, the sacrality of existence. So let's go to some of the main themes of the book without wanting, of course, to do a big spoiler for those who would like to read it. So Eliade describes the world, interestingly, sacred space, let's use that term. He describes sacred space as the center of the world, axis mundi. That's the Latin term. Axis means like the center, mundi, of the world. So sacred space is the center of the world, where heaven and earth meet. And this sacred space is not necessarily something physical, but it's a state of consciousness, a way of perceiving things. Of course, somehow in our tradition, we will have these ideas in the Vaishnava tradition, Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, by speaking about Vrindavan as a spiritual world, but also as a setting appearing on earth, but also as a state of consciousness. That's a very interesting idea. Because first we have, Vrindavan, Golok Vrindavan, the spiritual world is some realm, transcendent realm, which is outside of this planet Earth, first. Then we have Boma Vrindavan, or Gokul, sometimes the earthly Vrindavan is that replica manifestation on planet Earth of that transcendent abode. Second. Third, we hear from personalities like Srila Siddhar Maharaj and others, Vrindavan is a state of consciousness. So you follow my point. Vrindavan is not limited outside of this earth. It comes here, but it's not only even limited to its physical location in India. It can be everywhere and anywhere, provided we are in sacred space. So we are not talking about here like locations, but ultimately thresholds that manifest. It's not something that can be located on a map. That's my point. It's located in intimacy with the divine. If you are there, you are there. If you are there internally, you are there with your whole being. So this is the main point that Mircea Eliade explores, axis mundi, the principle of sacred space, and how, of course, he goes through different traditions to show the correlations and how throughout times and cultures we can find very similar patterns of this archetypal, mythical. Something mythical, just to clarify, a myth It's not something that is not true. A myth is something that is always true throughout cultures, throughout times, and manifests in slightly different ways here and there, but its essence is the same. Another interesting concept that Mircea Eliade introduces the concept of hierophany. Herophony, which basically means the eruption of the sacred into the profane. And the point with this is not so much that everything is profane and the sacred erupts, but we see things in a profane way. And with the proper vision or environment or ritual or initiation, we experience this eruption, this hierophany, which again, in our Bhakti tradition, this is not something abstract, it's something deeply embodied. How the so-called ordinary reveals the extraordinary, and how the divine appears on this world as an avatar, is omnipresent in every atom, in sound, in relationship, different forms of divine descent, different forms of avatar, Shastra avatar, Arch avatar, Nama avatar, and so on. This avatar principle in our tradition, which means crossing from up to down, the sacred descending into what otherwise will be perceived as profane, is the ultimate hierophany. Also, Mircea Eliade, and this work in particular, speaks about time, how we experience time. He speaks about circular time, he speaks about linear time, he speaks about sacred time, ordinary perception of time, and sacred mythical perception of time. Sometimes it's described in the terms of kairos and chronos. Chronos will be the ordinary passage of time as we may perceive it, and kairos refers to a spiritual, sacred sense of time. He even makes an interesting connection between the word tempus, related to time, and templum, related to temple, and how proper perception of time takes us to templum, takes us to the temple, to a sacred perception of how things unfold. So sacred time is not escape of history, but it's an entering into eternity. In fact, he says that in the book. I will be sharing a few sections from the book. He will say, it can be said of sacred time that it is always the same, that it is a succession of eternities, that sacred time, because it is composed of an eternal present, which is indefinitely recoverable. So you can always go back to the eternal present. It's always there. It's always the same in that sense, not that it's a monotonous repetition forever. So it's a succession of eternities. If you learn to live in the present with a proper awareness of sacredness, you are in eternity. You are in eternity. Another important topic from this book, a classic coming from Mircea Eliade, is rituals. Rituals, the role of ritual throughout religions and traditions, rites of passage, initiation, and so on. So rituals are not mere mechanical, formulaic things that we follow without knowing what we are doing. They are deep, significant return journeys to the moment of origin, to our source, to our awareness of the sacred. For example, to give an example, he goes to the Vedic tradition many times, to the Vedas many times. He's speaking about what we may call sometimes Agnihotra Yajna, or fire sacrifice. And understanding the symbology and the archetype behind that, he will say things like the erection of an altar to Agni, to start a fire, is nothing but the reproduction on the microcosmic scale of the creation. So he navigates a lot because between the macrocosmic and the microcosmic, and how in the micro level we are reproducing even unconsciously many of these patterns and templates that basically constitute the foundation of existence, the structure of reality. I personally liked one section in which he speaks about diksha, or initiation, and of course in our tradition we will use that term. You are his second born, dvija. The Sanskrit term is dvija, born again. So he goes through the symbology of dying and being born, and how the diksha ritually transforms. He will say diksha ritually transforms the sacrificer, the one who is receiving diksha, into an embryo, and causes him to be born a second time. And then he goes to sections from the Vedas which literally uses that terminology of entering into an embryo, being born again, of course dying to something to be born again. he will give this interesting imaginary of Socrates. In ancient Greek, Socrates, he had good reason, Mircea Eliade said, he had good reason to compare himself to a midwife. In this case, Socrates will be representing the role of the guru. So it's a very interesting way to see the guru as a midwife. Midwife is someone who is assisting in giving birth, right? Because in fact, Socrates, Mircea Eliade will say, he helped man to be born to consciousness. He delivered, not a baby, he delivered a new man. So in this way, we can use these terminologies, even if you say these are just words, but they can help us to further grasp what's actual diksha, what it entails as a rite of passage, as a death, as a birth. What's the meaning of the symbology there? So we don't go through them mechanically, superficially. Another main topic from the book is nature. Nature and the sacred. Again, seeing God in the elements. Eliade shows how throughout cultures, and as you can know, ancient cultures will see trees, rivers, mountains as sacred, as inhabited by God, as inhabited by personalities. And Bhakti honors this too. I remember starting my book, Radical Personalism, with a quote from Srila Siddhar Maharaj speaking about this, how the ancient rishis or seers of reality address mountains, rivers, everything in a personal way, as a person, in terms of relationality. We will speak about rivers as goddess, the goddess Jamuna. We will worship Govardhan, not as mere stone, but as the divine itself, and so on and so forth. There's a section that I'd like to share from the book with you in this connection, which comes from this chapter called The Sacredness of Nature and Cosmic Religion. So briefly, Mircea Eliade say, for example, a sacred stone is venerated because it is sacred, not because it is a stone. It is the sacrality manifested through the mode of being of the stone that reveals its true essence. So this is especially true in our tradition, that for the uninformed one, it may seem, okay, you're worshiping a stone. That's mere animism. You're worshiping nature as if it's God. But actually, we are not worshiping a stone. We are worshiping the sacrality in the stone. And from that perspective, we can worship anything and everything, because there is sacrality, latent sacrality in everything, which externally doesn't mean that I'm worshiping the glass, no, or that I'm worshiping the pen. But if I have the eyes to see the sacrality, that is through which everything is interpenetrated, everything is worshipable ultimately. And then comes the closing of the book, which arguably for me is one of the favorite section, which speaks about the sacred and profane in the modern world. So going from ancient traditions and the rites and how they view nature and time and space, now we come to the modern times. Now, this book was written in the previous century. So he's speaking about modern desacralization, basically. The modern loss of sacred vision, the secularized vision of everything, and nothing has inherent meaning and purpose. The mundane is mundane. And of course, he's trying to make this point. That's not the case. Mundane is not to be rejected. Mundane is to be re-seen, rediscovered, respected, as I like to say. Respect comes from the Latin re spessare. Spessare means spectacles. Re means again, to look anew, to look again. All matter is potentially sacred when offered with love. But he creates this contrast between the view of the modern man in general and the view of the ancient traditions. So I'd like to share with you, to include two sections in this connection, contrasting one another. So first, he goes to the view of the modern man. He says, it is only in the modern societies of the West that non-religious man has developed fully. Modern non-religious man assumes a new existential situation. He regards himself solely as the subject and agent of history, and he refuses all appeal to transcendence. In other words, he accepts no model for humanity outside the human condition as it can be seen in the various historical situations. Man makes himself, and he only makes himself completely in proportion as he desacralizes himself and the world. The sacred is the prime obstacle to his freedom. He will become himself only when he is totally demysticized. He will not be truly free until he has killed the last god. It's a very interesting way of depicting the postmodern individualist society in which we are living today. Postmodern over subjectivity, where everything is devoid of purpose until and unless I give whatever purpose I wish to give it. So then he contrasts that by speaking about the proper view that he will depict in terms of the homo religiosus. So he says like this: whatever the historical context in which he is placed, homo religiosus always believes that there is an absolute reality, the sacred, which transcends this world but manifests itself in this world, thereby sanctifying it and making it real. He further believes that life has a sacred origin and that human existence realizes all of its potentialities in proportion as it is religious, that is, participates in reality. So again, I hope you get the word, the terminology of Mircea Eliade here. When he's speaking about religion, he's not necessarily speaking about the institutional affiliation, but the participation in the sacredness of reality. And he makes this point: we can only actualize our potentialities as much as we can live religiously, embrace reality in its sacredness, participate in it. And then he concludes very interestingly in this same chapter, speaking about how the majority of the so-called irreligious still behave religiously, even unconsciously, if they are not aware of that fact, right? Like modern man, postmodern man still have lots of superstitions and taboos coming from a magical religious environment. Lot of what Mircea Eliade will call camouflaged myths or degenerated rituals. And he gives different examples. No? He speaks about Marxism, he speaks about psychoanalysis, and how each of these contemporary ideals or practices are filled with religiosity, even if outwardly they may consider themselves secular and even atheist. Let me show you an interesting example he gives in this regard, regarding nudism. So he says, example are nudism or the movements for complete sexual freedom, ideologies in which we can discern traces of the nostalgia for Eden, the desire to reestablish the paradisal state before the fall, when sin did not yet exist and there was no conflict between the pleasures of the flesh and conscience. So this one example of how something that outwardly we may conduct it in a very degrading way even, always contains a background of religious nostalgia and longing. And he, of course, will say this is not surprising, because the profane modern man is a descendant of the ancient man, the homo religiosus. And naturally, you cannot wipe out your own story, your own DNA, the behavior of your religious ancestors, which made we who we are today. So anyhow, it's a beautiful book, The Sacred of the Profane by Mircea Eliade. It's a powerful, it offers, of course, lots of knowledge and a small introduction. He himself says here, this is an introduction only. Here we have something way more elaborate, as I was showing in the beginning. But it offers also a powerful diagnosis for modernity's spiritual disorientation in general, and its thirst for that, and a passionate argument for the enduring human need to re-enchant existence, to rediscover, to live in a magical reality, to inhabit the sacredness. So it's a book for spiritual seekers, for theologians, for everyone. It's a mirror, it's a map. So more than invited to go through it. So a few thoughts regarding Mircea Eliade's The Sacred of the Profane. Let me know your thoughts if you have gone through the book, if you plan to go through the book, or if you just would like to join the conversation on some of the themes we've shared in this little clip today. See you very soon for our next section of Swami Reacts.